Back when I was a kid, the NBA was larger than life. Everybody I knew was a basketball fan, even the kids that didn't really like sports. The most popular video games were basketball games too. I really believe that this was the golden age of the NBA. And the funny thing about that golden age is that all of the accomplishments of the past were legendary to kids like me who grew up during this golden age. Right, so I remember hearing about like the Boston Celtics dynasty from my dad, who was a fan back before the sport became really popular. I remember seeing those clips of Dr. J defying gravity and thinking that he was like Superman. And we all remember the legends of Wilt Chamberlain, the guy who scored 100 points in a single game. But there's something you probably don't realize about the NBA back when Wilt scored 100. The NBA was far from the popular sport that it would eventually become. Actually, not that many people paid attention to the Knicks-Warriors game in Hershey, Pennsylvania on March 2, 1962. The fact alone that this game was not played in Philadelphia should be a clue to you that things were a little bit different back in those days. Now, there's also quite a bit of irony at work here, right? So back in 1962, the NBA was mostly unknown. It was still playing in small towns around the country to try to stir up interest in the game. Meanwhile, I happen to have a complete copy of the fourth quarter broadcast of that Chamberlain 100-point game, the radio broadcast. I wanted to stick it up on YouTube, only to be told that the rights holder won't allow any of it to go up. You can't even put it up and not make money off of it. They won't allow any of it to be shown. So now we've gone from a league that was once desperate to get any kind of attention to a situation where you cannot share its most memorable moment with anybody else. And it only took us 65 years. So you see, back in 1963, somebody recorded a rebroadcast of that fourth quarter of that famous game using a reel-to-reel recorder. The report is that the original station decided to tape over the original broadcast tape, which was common for radio stations at the time. Fortunately, they rebroadcast the game at something like 3 in the morning before they taped over the tape. That let this random student get a tape recording of that pivotal fourth quarter. And yet, if you try to upload the recording to YouTube, Penguin Random House won't let you play any of it, and note that it's not the NBA with this copyright claim. Now, I could challenge it, but I'm not going to. It's just not worth it. I just think it's amazing, though, that a radio broadcast from before 1973, which I believe is public domain by default, has a copyright claim on it. Anyway, enough of that subject, and if you really want to listen to it, go check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description, and I've got a lot more there than just the fourth quarter of Chamberlain's 100-point game. My point here, though, is that the NBA really was desperate for legitimacy in the early 1960s, and there were also some really good reasons for critics of the league to be skeptical back then. As you may or may not know, the NBA was preceded by a couple of other professional leagues, for example, the old American Basketball League. The old ABL existed for about 6 years as a loose confederation of independent professional teams. This is in the 20s and 30s. Now, the league did not last. This was due in part to the Depression, but also because it simply could not attract fans. And the same thing was true of the old National Basketball League, which you probably have never heard of. That was one of the leagues that merged with the Basketball Association of America, another league you probably have never heard of, back in the late 1940s. That's how the NBA was born. Now, it's not that there was no professional basketball back before the NBA. It's just that most people didn't pay attention to it. You see, most people thought of basketball as a college sport. This is also, by the way, the exact same problem that the NFL faced at exactly the same time. And so, in order to raise money and draw fans, the NBL frequently would hold double headers, oftentimes amateur games alongside pro games. And it was also common for professional teams to play games in smaller cities. In this case, Chicago and Fort Wayne were scheduled to play in Richmond, Indiana. And these weren't exhibitions, these were actual regular season games and were relatively inexpensive. In this particular case, there was about a week's worth of hype for this game, which Fort Wayne won 38-30. However, the box score didn't bother to tell us how many people actually showed up. Now, you're probably wondering why I am bringing that old news up. Well, it's because the NBA kept this practice alive when it was first established. In fact, playing regular season games in neutral sites was normal, and it happened all the time. So, for example, take this November 22nd, 1950 game between the Fort Wayne Pistons and the defending champion Minneapolis Lakers. This was played in Minneapolis, but it was preceded by an amateur game, another one of those famous doubleheaders. As you know, this was the game where Fort Wayne used an extremely defensive strategy to win 19-18. This is the game that inspired the 24-second shot clock. Everybody knows about that atrocity of a game, but what most people don't realize is that the same two teams played in Fort Wayne the next night, with the Pistons winning 73-63. Later that same season, on January 20th, 1951, the same two teams played in Milwaukee at the new Civic Auditorium. So the league really must have made that schedule out at the beginning of the season. I mean, can you imagine taking the teams that just set the record for the lowest point total in the history of the league and having them play on a neutral site to attract new fans? And why play in Milwaukee of all cities? I'm guessing that the league thought that it might be able to expand there, maybe, something like that. It just seems really odd in hindsight. Anyway, this time the Lakers won comfortably, 89-70. There were some bizarre scheduling shenanigans in the old days too. For example, the Warriors played in Minnesota on February 13, 1955. The next night, February 14th, the Warriors faced the Rochester Royals in Toledo, Ohio. This was the second of a two-game doubleheader. The first game was another NBA game, the Syracuse Nationals versus the Milwaukee Hawks. The Royals and Warriors then squared off again in Buffalo, New York on February 15th. That's the very next night. The Royals and Warriors faced each other once again on February 16th, this time in Saratoga Springs. And then on February 17th, the Royals and Warriors played each other for the fourth night in a row, this time in New Haven, Connecticut. That's right, there were 4 straight neutral site games in a row involving the same two teams. But the Philadelphia Warriors didn't just play 5 nights in a row during that stretch in 1955. No, there was a 6th game as well. On February 18th, the Warriors hosted the Syracuse Nationals back in Philadelphia, making it 6 games in 6 consecutive nights in 6 different cities. The players of the Philadelphia Warriors back in 1955 might not look like much, but you really would have to be hardcore to play 6 nights in a row in 6 different cities. So the thing that I'm saying here is that the league was just way different back in those days, a lot different than the league that you and I grew up with. And that's part of the reason why Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point effort wasn't the huge news that we would expect it to be. You really don't need me to tell you how incredible Wilt was in 1961-62, which is the year that all of the records fell. Wilt averaged over 50 points a game that season and actually averaged more than 48 minutes on the court per game. He only missed a few minutes all season after fouling out. On December 8, 1961 in Philadelphia, Wilt scored 78 points for the Warriors in a triple overtime loss to the Lakers, and Elgin Baylor scored 63. Now this was technically a record, beating a mark that Elgin Baylor had set in a non-overtime game, but Wilt only scored 53 in regulation. The other 25 came in overtime. Wilt then beat Baylor's 4-quarter record by scoring 73 against the Chicago Packers on January 13, 1962. But although that game set records, it really didn't attract many fans. There were only about 3,500 fans in Philadelphia that day. And so when you take it into that context, it's really not a huge surprise that scoring 100 points in a single game didn't generate that much media buzz around North America. The NBA could get the headlines in the cities where the league was already established, but the truth is that most people were just not interested in professional basketball, not in those days. To give you an idea, the Philadelphia Inquirer did mention the 100-point total on the front page, but you could only see it if you looked way down at the bottom. The article itself was on page 17. This was lodged underneath an article about the Floyd Patterson-Sonny Liston fight, as well as an article about the Philly spring training. In fact, this picture was actually from a college game, not that NBA game. And the thing is, that was normal for the Philadelphia Inquirer. For whatever reason, the paper just never printed any pictures from NBA games, but they printed tons of pictures from high school games. At least the Philadelphia Daily News bothered to use a few photographs of Chamberlain. The article from the Daily News was the longest one on the accomplishment. Unfortunately, though, Wilt didn't even get a mention on the front page. Anyway, that's how different things were back then. As bad as things were for the NBA in the early 1980s and the late 1970s, at least there was some coverage of the sport. The coverage back in the early 1960s was worse than bad. It was just awful. And that brings me to the big question that people always ask about this, which was, why was there no television coverage of Wilt's big game? The NBA had been on NBC since 1954, but the ratings were really bad. Part of the problem was that NBC aired only 1 game a week on Saturday afternoons and was unusually excited to put on really bad teams like Cincinnati, Syracuse, and Detroit. So, for example, the day after Wilt scored 100 points, NBC planned on broadcasting a game nationwide. It was between the Lakers and St. Louis, and St. Louis was one of the worst teams in the league. Anyway, so don't feel too bad about not having video of Wilt scoring 100. The Philadelphia Warriors were only on NBC 3 times in the 1961-62 season. That was it, and there was no local television coverage. Then in the playoffs, they were on 3 more times. NBC then ended the contract with the NBA at the end of that season, and the NBA moved over to ABC. Anyway, that gives you an idea of what the media coverage was like when Wilt was a superstar. The funny thing is that the NBA was so unpopular back in those days that you can't even find good basketball cards of Wilt. The only 2 cards from his early career that received sales nationwide were from the 1961-62 Fleer set. And so I guess he'll forever be remembered for dunking a 2-pointer. Anyway, if I had known all of these random facts when I was a kid, I probably wouldn't have considered the performance that legendary. And the thing is that when people today talk about the era of the plumbers, in 1961-62, it actually was kind of correct. Most of these players had to have jobs in the off season so that they could live. Anyway, it's all good. You got to start somewhere, I know, and the NBA really has grown up a lot since then. Now, I don't think that we'll ever see another person score 100 points in a single game, but the thing is that if it does happen, at least we'll be able to watch it this time.